Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching The PhD Parent. So timeout is a parenting strategy used in many conventional or so-called light positive parenting interventions. For example, parent-child interaction therapy, parent management training, and Triple P. In this video, I'll provide an overview of how timeout is implemented in such interventions. If you want to know more about the other kinds of strategies used in these interventions, then you can check out my video in the link below. In addition, if you want to know more about timeout, in another video, I provide a detailed introduction to timeout and review research investigating its effectiveness. I have another video in which I review research investigating the most effective way to implement timeout, and I also have a video in which I review research that's looked at whether timeout can be harmful, and there's no evidence that it is. The links to these videos are all down below. So before getting stuck into it, a quick bit of background information. So timeout is actually called timeout from positive reinforcement. That is, for timeout to be effective, a kid must be having timeout from positive stuff. For example, praise, attention, hugs, spending quality time with parents, and so on. So the argument is that you need to be doing all the other positive stuff described if timeout is going to work. So onto the basics of timeout. As described in another video, there's no good research evidence to indicate what the most effective way to implement timeout is. In the absence of research evidence, it's sensible to go with expert opinion, such as the timeout procedures used in positive parenting interventions. And there are differences across positive parenting interventions in terms of how they recommend timeout should be implemented, but it might involve something like the following. First, to emphasize one overarching rule, stay calm. Timeout should be delivered in a matter-of-fact way. So, when a kid has to go to timeout, you take them away from the situation. That is, to another space or room. Stick them in a chair if one is available. Wherever the kid sits, they should be placed so that you can still see them, but where they can't get their hands on anything interesting, such as a book, can't damage the place, such as a wall or cupboard, and can't see the TV or other entertainment devices. Timeout is for 3 minutes, or you can go with the 1 minute per year of age rule. Some interventions say that 3 minutes is the upper limit, but others say that 5 minutes is the upper limit. Now during timeout, no one should interact with the child. That is, ignore everything that's said by the kid during the timeout period. But don't ignore behaviors that could lead to injury, for example, standing on the chair. I'll discuss how positive parenting interventions suggest how you should deal with these kinds of behaviors in a moment. So now some of the finer details and potential obstacles that might have to be overcome when implementing timeout. So first of all, one warning. If your kid doesn't obey your instruction, don't repeat it, instead give them a warning. For example, if you don't do X, then you're going to go to timeout. If they still don't obey, they're into timeout. Only give a warning if you're going to follow through. If you give a warning but don't follow through, the timeout won't be effective. Next, don't make a fuss. If the kid has to go to timeout, act quickly, be calm and matter-of-fact about the process, which may be easier said than done, and limit the amount you talk to your child. That is, no debate or arguing, just briefly explain why they're going to timeout. For example, you didn't do X, so you have to go to timeout. Once they're in timeout, move away. And follow through on timeout even if the kid ends up doing what they were told. So if you tell the kid they've got to go to timeout, and that gets them to follow the instruction, they still got to go to timeout. The rationale is that you don't want to encourage the child to only respond when they're told they need to go to timeout. So now on to the 5-second rule. The idea here is that you don't want to let the kid loose from timeout if they're making a fuss either behaviorally, kicking, or verbally, such as whinging. Because this may result in an association whereby the child thinks that their not so good behavior results in the termination of timeout. So once you get to the end of timeout, for example 3 minutes, for it to actually end, the kid must be peaceful and quiet for 5 seconds. If not, then the 5 seconds starts again, repeating the process until they're peaceful and quiet. I've seen other approaches in which you don't start timeout until the kid is peaceful and quiet, in this case for 10 seconds rather than 5 seconds. Guess you could give this a go if you wanted to. So now on to the end of timeout. So once timeout is over, ask your child whether they're ready to do what they were asked. That is, timeout is not a way of the child avoiding doing what they've been told. If they say no, then they stay in timeout. I couldn't find any suggestions for how long, but presumably no longer than 3 minutes. Maybe 1 minute and then ask again. There's no science to this, so you'll have to wing it. If they say yes, but don't end up doing what they were asked, then it's back into timeout. If they say yes and they do what they're told, then happy days. Praise them, but only a little. Think of it as polite acknowledgement. A simple thank you will suffice. Now on to escape from timeout and/or unsafe behaviors while in the chair. Here, I've seen 2 suggestions. First, use a timeout room, and second, the kid loses privileges. For example, they can't play with a toy or something. I'll focus on the first one. Now, the most important thing about a timeout room is that it's safe. Apparently, the kid's bedroom is the most popular choice. So if they escape from timeout or they're being unsafe, stick them back in timeout or seat them appropriately and give them a warning that they'll have to go to the timeout room. If they continue, off they go to the timeout room for 1 minute. And you've got to try and ignore any protests. They're allowed out of the timeout room when they're quiet for 5 seconds once the 1 minute period has expired. Once they're out of the room, back into timeout for the full duration, and repeat if necessary. So now, when to use timeout. The most straightforward way to describe when to use timeout is to describe when not to use it. So, according to Dads and Tully, don't use timeout for behaviours where the kid was unable to or didn't understand an instruction, they made a mistake, or the behaviour was driven by an overwhelming emotional state, for example, fear. If the behaviour doesn't fall into one of these categories, then probably okay to use timeout. If the behaviour does fall into one of these categories, then the approach is to help the kid through whatever difficulty they're experiencing. For example, how they can regulate their emotion. For the moment though, that's it for timeout as implemented in positive parenting interventions. If there's anything I've gotten wrong or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.